Abendorf.
Not yet.
Welcome. Today we're in the garden with two members of the Acadiana Orchid Society, Joe Abendroth and Janet Gentiloni, who are here to share with you their love and their enthusiasm for orchids. Welcome.
Hello.
And they're here, of course, because they are having an orchid show this month, which we want to invite each and every one of you to attend. It is June the 22nd, a Saturday from 10 to 5, and June the 23rd from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Many people have questions about orchids and probably have wanted to grow, or after this show will have a desire to grow orchids and have just so many questions and are intimidated by the whole process. And we want to encourage each of you to come to the Orchid Society meetings, and they're when, Joe?
The Orchid Society meets every third Monday of the month. We start at 7 o'clock. We have a little one-hour meeting, and that will entail a speaker or some program and a social after that. It's just basically we have food and drinks. And we are, and I know a lot of orchid societies, we are a very loose group in that we're, how would you
Casual.
say it, Janet? Casual?
Casual.
We have every
I would
level
say
of
that.
orchid grower, and we really have fun. Janet and her husband Bobby have a social every year out at their place with fried fish. It's a great fun, great hobby, and we will do backflips to have you come and join our society, because every flower or horticultural society is looking for new members.
Right, and they are glad to answer. You know, many times we feel hesitant to ask the basic questions and to admit that we don't know a thing about this flower. They will be happy to tell you everything that you need to know to successfully grow an orchid. If you've received one as a gift at this time of year, you know, people get Mother's Day gifts, and you're having trouble with it, or you've always wanted to pick one up and grow it, do that and show up at the Orchid Society. They will help you, they will answer all your questions, and encourage you to be a member of the orchid growing group.
That's true. With the show coming up so soon, that's another perfect opportunity to come by. We have exhibits that people will see. We have vendors who will be selling plants. We have raffle plants, so everyone can come away with a plant of their own and enjoy the exhibits as well.
Well, now we're going to briefly give you an overview of the orchid world, a very quick overview, and this is why we're directing you to the show and to the Orchid Society to finish answering questions. So, Joe, would you like to start off and tell us about some of the groups that you've brought today?
Thank you. Orchids, like any plant, the taxonomy is genus and species, and they're basically 6 or 8 very popular genuses, and then there are thousands of genuses that are not popular and very exotic. I became interested in slipper orchids several years back. Previously, I'd grown Phalaenopsis, the moth orchid you see at the home improvement stores and the grocery stores, and then these slippers just fascinate me. They are an orchid that are confined to very, very narrow endemics. They grow in a small area in Southeast Asia and a small area of South America, and then there are other genuses that are less important. But behind me are some examples of multiflora papopedilums. It's PAPH. We call them PAPs. And then on the left over here are 2 more. These are multifloras that come from a group of slippers that throw more than one flower on an inflorescence or spike at a time. We'll go over the culture of this later as we have time. Orchids, as you know, are epiphytes or lithophytes, which means the majority of them that we grow do not grow in soil. There are terrestrial orchids that do grow in soil. Up front, there's another group of multifloras from another group, and the parent of that flower to the right is to the left. That is Papillium lowii, and then one of the hybrids of it. You can see the similarities in the 2 flowers. This is the only Phragmipedium I bought. That's P-H-R-A-G, Phragmipedium. Pedium is a Latin suffix that means foot or shoe, and you can see where it comes from. All these orchids have these wide mouths at the bottom. It's a modified lip that makes a slipper. This orchid is named Kovachii for a man named Kovach, and he discovered this orchid in 2002 in the eastern side of the Andes in Peru. Very, very, very fascinating story about how the orchid was brought to this country and the legality and illegality of it. You can Google that and read it. It's really great reading. The other thing I wanted to cover right quickly is some species. Can we do that? Here, by species, as I said, this means the native orchid gene as it occurs in the wild. This is a hybrid of this species. The names are not important. This is called Delinei, but it's an orchid species. Now, this orchid has been on this spike for 8 weeks, maybe 2 months, 3 months. You can see how they hold up. This orchid is much fresher. Here's another species called Superbum. Really droopy. I love this flower. This is Chamberlainianum, which is a little pixie-like thing, very cute. And then this is an example of complex orchid breeding, and it's very late in the season for those. We get those in the cooler spring, and this is one of the last ones I had. I'm just showing the yellow there. The majority of these paps are difficult to some extent, but there are examples of pap species and hybrids that are very, very easy. And if you're interested in slippers, get in touch with me, and I will show you where to start and how to do it.
Right. Now, Janet's brought some of her favorites. I think Janet is more of an outdoor orchid grower. Joe actually has greenhouses because that fits the growing requirements of the group of orchids that he has become, you know, enthralled with. But you are able to grow them outdoors,
Yes.
giving them shelter in the winter. So could you discuss a few of the orchids that you've brought?
That's right. Most of what I have in my collection are plants that like to be outdoors. They can tolerate our warm summers. Some of the things Joe has requires a cool greenhouse, so his growing conditions have to be more structured. But what I do is, right now, for instance, these plants are outside. They're under an arbor with some shade cloth on it, and we watch when we first put them out to see if they're going to like those conditions. This is a dendrobium, and when you talk about flowers that last a long time, this is a good one. This spike will last for weeks and weeks and weeks on my plant. Since I tend to let my plants get rather big, I just cut some flowers today to bring in. So this one is outdoors most of the year. When it gets really cold, we do bring them into the greenhouse and we heat our greenhouse. We also have a number of cattleyas. This is one of our cattleyas that has performed well for us. If you see, the lip really goes like this. It grew a little crooked.
Okay.
See, the lip should be down. And then,
Janet, the lip is obviously where the flower tries to attract a pollinator to fly in there and mount on or land on the reproductive part of the flower. Isn't that right?
that's correct. And that's why you see so many different lips. For instance, this is a Digbiano, and look at the frill on that lip. And that flower evolved to attract a certain moth, probably. Right. And there are moths with proboscis that are very, very long in order to go in and pollinate certain orchids. So it's really fascinating once you start to learn about the tens of thousands of different kinds of orchids.
And there are, let's say that,
Yes.
thousands upon thousands of orchids. And what is this?
And this is another cattleya. This is called Alelia lobata. And again, I like this one, especially because of the color contrast with the purple and then the green on the flower.
And we missed this.
That is an oncidium. It was grown in Hawaii, and I brought it over. That's a great place to acquire plants. The Hawaiians grow fabulous plants. The oncidiums are large alliance. They have a lot of intergeneric crossing, which this is. This is two genera put together, and very nice. They have a large range of colors: pinks, purples, reds, golds.
And we have to mention the little minis, which our producer is enthused with. These grow on cork, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. The medium, you discussed the fact that most of these plants are epiphytic, which means they're not getting food and nourishment from the soil. But we did want you to also see the little minis, the range and size of the flowers. What's one of the larger orchids?
We have orchids that get 10 feet tall,
Right.
Gametophyllum and different, you can, and they're not very popular with greenhouse people. because they take up so much room.
Right.
And
That's
flowers are this Colopicingii, it takes up so much. It's the only one that I keep. I had a flask of these, and they grew so big I just didn't have room for them.
Yes, so you're going for more.
Well, Nancy grows these miniatures, and she grows on cork, which is a wonderful, wonderful substrate. But you can grow a miniature orchid on a piece of wood you find in your yard. You can grow it on an oak, or they grow great on cypress. We have a lot of cypress around here. And you can go get cypress. It's almost an art form, some of these cypress pieces that some of these growers have, and they have these really exotic epiphytics coming off the cypress stumps and driftwood.
Let's discuss some of the various mediums that the orchids are in. I noticed some are in pots, some are in the baskets.
Well, I noticed that I think all gardeners are the same. Gina had a list here, and it's just exactly what I look at when I look at an orchid or any plant: light, water, humidity, fertilizer, temperature, and the root environment or the pot that it grows in. Now, you can grow an orchid. If you were an orchid person or an orchid explorer and it was 1850 and you were looking for, and you found an orchid, what they used to do, and they do now too, is to find what type of water it was getting, what its temperature range was for the 12-month cycle, what kind of light in foot candles or however you were going to measure the light, how much humidity it was in each month, and that's the way you would obviously grow that species in a captured environment. However, orchids adapt, just like people. They can adapt to all kind of ranges. Now, some of them won't, some of them will die, but an orchid can adapt and grow quite well. And there's another thing that really works well. It's what we call hybrid vigor. When you cross two orchids, they become more vigorous. They do better. So species sometimes are tough. You take the species, put it with another species, and you can grow the dickens out of that. But to answer your question, what type of potting medium we use, it's interesting. You can, and this is a lot like trying to get an answer from a politician. I agree. But there's a book by Howard Kubowitz where he lists the top 10 slipper growers he thinks, and all 10 of them use different
mediums.
But we use bark. We don't like pine bark as much as we like fir bark. There's another bark called kiwi bark, which is a New Zealand pine. Actually, it's a Monterey pine. And then we dilute that with aggregates, usually benign aggregates that maintain a neutral pH, and then we add substrates to hold water or not hold water. So basically, you can go to Walmart, I can't advertise here, but you can go to a store and buy an orchid mix in a bag that is designed for Phalaenopsis, designed for Cattleyas, and it'll do just fine. You have to change that orchid mix every now and then because it deteriorates and the bacterial overgrowth in there start robbing nitrogen from the plant. So basically, orchid mix, commercial orchid mix is what we use. You can make your own cheaper than you can buy it.
Right. And you're also being specific to whatever orchid you're getting. Now, they all require a fair amount of humidity, Janet.
Yes, for the most part, the humidity does not hurt the orchids. They like it. And you learn what your watering requirements are, too, depending on what your humidity level is, what your season is. So as you watch and see, how they need, you just check to see how damp they might be and give them a good watering schedule with a very diluted fertilizer on most of the waterings is how we do it.
Do you let them dry out between waterings?
I do.
Okay, I noticed you were poking your finger, though. Poke the finger.
The slippers varies. I classify them wet to dry, wet to damp, or damp all the time. So you've got three groups.
Right.
But we all know practically, the practicality of it, we usually just water, and whoever survives.
Whoever you hit,
first man up,
We're always trying new things at our place. This year my husband added some little sprayers to the top of the arbor, and it puts out a fine mist. And I think that's going to help a lot when it gets really hot because, when we get water on us, we cool down, and so will the plants.
And that's the environment that most of these come from, so you would suspect that the mist is going to really be good for them. And they do have to be repotted, as you mentioned. Occasionally the potting medium breaks down.
We could demonstrate a repotting system, but anybody that has a question about an orchid that they got, or they acquired and can't, want to know if it needs repotting, just give us a call and we'll be glad to look at it and tell them.
And do discuss the roots, too, that are the...
That's a good example.
Exactly.
All right, this is an ascocendrum, and the reason I brought it, it is bred into this which is another, this little orchid is on cork. You can see the root system on this orchid. This is Neophanida falcium or something like that. It's a Japanese orchid, very sought after, and we breed, this is a pink flower about this big, and we breed this into this. I mean, we breed these two together and we get this, which is Ascophanida. And I just thought it was interesting to see the difference. I wish I had this in flower. Now the roots are aerial roots. This root is coming out to really actually there's water vapor in the air, depending on the humidity, and it will get water. It'll also fertilize, pick up fertilizer. It's got a vellum on it, a real soft thing. If you looked at it under a microscope, you would see all these little villi coming out, and it increases the surface area of the roots. And this one is wrapping around this little teak basket or mahogany basket. And you can see it's in there like, you know, it gets really stuck. It'll wrap around, oops, well, we had one accident, I'm sorry.
We got it.
This one is wrapping into that cork, and it's stuck to that cork. And you can add little, and I saw, it was it you or somebody, they would put this slow release fertilizer up here where when you water it'll drip down there.
It goes on to it.
Sometimes I do that depending on the plant and whatever.
Now, do they get diseases? Do they have pests?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I'm afraid so. We can't avoid that.
No.
One of the big things with cattleyas is the scale can be an issue, and of course that you can help avoid that by watching your plants, letting them dry out between waterings, and not keeping them too damp, not keeping them too crowded. But scale is one thing that we tend to watch for carefully. And really, other than that, we don't have a lot of problems with bugs. How do you do, Joe?
You don't see scale on the slippers. You see spider mites, which are little leaf miners that get under there. I've actually introduced a systemic insecticide I use. A lot of the purists don't like to do that. They like to use an organic type base, and you get neem oil and some different, actually clove oil and different things sprayed on the plant. But when you have a large orchid such as this that you're very, very proud of, you don't want to experiment. So that orchid is on a systemic insecticide and a systemic miticide. But you can do it without that. Pests are not a big problem. They're very tough. People are afraid to touch them. You can grab these things and pick them up by the leaf. They're fine.
Now, another question. How, with such beauty, do you begin to choose? I mean, what spoke to you, say, about the cattleyas?
That's an easy answer. It's what lives where you live. Every person's growing conditions can be different. And for instance, I started out with Phalaenopsis, the moth orchids that are so popular. For some reason, where I live now, they don't do very well for me. So I've migrated more to the ones that can take more sun and so forth, and are happy outside with greenhouse only for the winter. But if you have a patio, if people have a patio, they can grow orchids, and when it's very, very cold, they might need to bring them in occasionally. For the most part, if you can give them the right light for the type of orchid you have, they're going to be okay. And for people who don't have a lot of space, things like the minis are wonderful.
Right, you just have to, I guess, leap in and start growing, expect maybe to kill a few plants. We've, as gardeners, have all done that.
That's true.
And, okay, do you see any differences between the things that men like to grow and the things that women like to grow, or everybody across the board makes personal choices?
I don't know. Men tend to come to the meeting, and some of the wives are the grower, and then there are other things such as my wife doesn't grow. She asked me how do we get to it. She said, let me get this straight. You want to grow the most expensive orchid that has to be cooled? Why are we doing that? Why don't we grow the easy one? I said, well, I've done that. I want to grow
You
this.
like the challenge.
It's time for something new. Yeah.
No, there's no protocol. You'll see people that like orchids of various, and usually some of the commercial growers will have the whole spectrum, but then they have one area that they really are known for.
Well, and this is really what I was getting. See, you have, fallen in love with the spiders, and something about that intrigued you, as you got more into orchid development. At the orchid shows, do you see trends and fads?
Well, I think the Houston Orchid Show, I got a statement from it, had more slippers in it this year than they've ever had. And that's unusual because that's a southern show. So I think there is a fad going on. It's a lot of the orchid industry, or the orchid commercial industry, is driven by the Taiwanese. Taiwan has an unbelievable orchid industry. They had a nationalized sugar program years ago, and it went under because of the price of sugar went south. So they converted all those engineers, all those geneticists, all those biometric people into orchids, and they have the #1 orchid plant in the world, #1 potted plant in the world right now is the white Phalaenopsis. You see them everywhere. The Japanese and the Germans will now spend unbelievable amounts of money at weddings for white Phalaenopsis, and then the Taiwanese furnish those plants.
And the tissue culture too, I think, is what has made, this wonderful
Cloning.
The cloning. We just really don't appreciate the variety of plant material. Regular gardeners like us would not have had these plants available 50 years ago.
This is definitely a clone. But the interesting thing, one thing I like about slippers is you cannot clone slippers. I don't know why. We were researching some of that at UL with Dr. Brown and Dr. Lemon, but I don't know why you can't clone them. But you can clone cattleyas, you can clone Phalaenopsis, you can clone Oncidiums. Some of the cloning, as it gets out to long runs, the flowers get they're not as pretty at the end, but the clones, you can't tell them from the original.
Now, as a hobby grower, can you propagate?
You can, but it's
a difficult process.
Well, you've got to have a lab, you've got to have sterile techniques, you've got to have a laminar flow hood, you've got to have flasking material, you've got to have growing medium. I was doing some of it at the college, but it's so much more efficient and so much more economical to buy a flask, to buy the bottle with the little things growing in it, and then break the bottle and put them in little compots.
It's also a time issue, because from seed to flower, 7 years is not unusual.
Right.
So you're devoting a whole lot of time. So I guess the question is, how interested are you in that particular aspect of it? And a couple of our members do that.
These are notorious for being very, very long from pot to flower, from compot to flower. And a lot of the breeding techniques with Rothschildianum and some of the bigger ones of these is to get a plant that will bloom in 4 years instead of 10 years. And that's very what the market is looking for.
And what they were mentioning were the flask, that they're little glass tubes, more or less, that and they're tissue cultured in those tubes. It's very, very difficult. We're going to switch back to the history of your little patio there, and talk about the fact that it's a very regulated industry because of for one thing, it's hard to import potting soil. That's one reason that they use the little flask. But we interrupted you about your story.
The story of Covacii? Oh, it's a very interesting story. Lee Moore and Michael Kovach were looking for, they'd heard about this flower in Peru, and Lee was sick that day, and Michael Kovach went out with Lee's driver, and the driver knew of a little roadside stand where the lady sold fruit and plants, and he asked her if she had seen a pink orchid, and she went behind this barn and brought out 2 of them. And she had them, they were in bloom, and she wanted the equivalent of about $5 for the 2.
$5, yeah.
And so Kovach was trying to deal with, and the driver said, "Senor, take this. You've got the holy grail of orchids here. Take this." So he took it. I don't know what happened to the second flower, but the flower that he bought for $250 was the one that went into the country and went to Marie Shelby, where they graded it and sent it to the Royal Horticultural Society, and it was named Covacii. Peru, the government of Peru, the agriculture, got very upset at that point. But but when you go to the mountains, or like Sandarinianum was on a small mountain in Burma at that time, is what the country was called, and they went in and took all the plants. They just took them all and took them to England or Germany, and this was 1800 and something. And that orchid was lost for 55 years. No one knew where it was, because it was all the plants they took died, and there was nothing back. Well, they'd seen it, had pictures of it, but then nature always wins, and the orchid regrew on the mountainside, and we have the orchid now.
Which is part of the reason that it's a very regulated
right.
industry now. It was overflower. They killed many of the orchids because they were in such a symbiotic relationship with the plants around them. So it is a regulated and restricted industry, but we still have a huge variety of plants that 50 years ago these would have only been in horticultural libraries. We would like to invite you to our June the 8th talk at the Rock and Garden shop. That will be Beat the Heat, and I will be speaking. On June the 15th, Dr. Dennis Woolard will be speaking at 10 o'clock at the R. Nelson Center on orchids. And of course, we want to encourage you again to go to the Orchid Show and Sale June the 22nd, Saturday from 10 to 5 and Sunday from 10 to 4, and bring your